The silence in Claire's home was overwhelming, thickening the air around her as though it had weight, a weight she felt with every step she took. The house they had built together, every corner filled with memories of their dreams and promises, now seemed like an empty shell. The quiet between her and Ethan, her husband, was no longer comforting. It was suffocating. The laughter they once shared, the spontaneous moments of affection, and even the shared glances that had once meant so much, were all distant echoes now. She had become invisible to him. Ethan's absence was not just physical, it was emotional, and it gnawed at her with a steady persistence. He came home late most nights, not because of work, but because he simply didn't want to be there. There were no more long conversations, no more laughter spilling over dinner tables. The mundane questions of, "How was your day?" had become meaningless, falling flat in the vast silence between them. Claire often wondered if he even saw her anymore. Did he notice when she walked into the room, or was she just another piece of furniture in the house they once called home? She tried to understand. After all, he was always working hard, trying to provide, trying to build the future they had promised each other. But the loneliness that hung between them, like an invisible wall, started to chip away at her sense of self. She wasn't angry at him. She wasn't frustrated. She was simply empty. It was a kind of loneliness that crept in so slowly that it took her a while to even realize it was there. But once she did, it felt like it had always been there, waiting for her to notice it. Every evening, Claire would set the table for 3. There was the plate for her, the one for Ethan, and the one for Jason, her stepson. And yet, she often ended up eating alone. Ethan would either come home late or not at all, disappearing into his study with no intention of joining her. Jason, though still under the same roof, had his own quiet world. He was 19 now, no longer the child she once tried so hard to bond with. His eyes were often distant, lost in his own private thoughts, the earbuds always in, a subtle wall she couldn't seem to break through. But that wasn't what hurt the most. What hurt was the realization that even in the same house, in the same space, she was utterly alone. As the weeks passed, Claire tried to reach out to Jason. She made his favorite snacks, asked about his day, and attempted to have small conversations. At times, she would sit next to him while he watched TV, offering the smallest gestures of connection. But every time, he would smile faintly, nod in acknowledgement, and retreat back into himself, pulling away again. It was as though there was a secret door between them that she could never open. She spent countless nights awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, trying to ignore the cold space beside her in bed. She missed the warmth of human connection, the soft touch of her husband, the shared laughter with her stepson. Those were things she no longer had. And in the absence of those, she found herself staring into the empty void that had become her life, unsure of where to turn or what to do. But then came the subtle shift, the smallest of moments, when Jason walked into the room and paused, looking at her as though trying to read something on her face, the way he lingered a bit longer than usual, as though reaching out for something that wasn't there. For the briefest moment, Claire felt a spark of something. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her heart race. Jason's distance was slowly giving way to something more, something that felt oddly familiar, like the first faint stirrings of a connection that had been buried for too long. In that moment, Claire was struck with the realization that she had been so desperate for connection that she would grasp at anything, even if it meant holding on to something that was fragile, something that wasn't meant to be there. She wanted to believe that Jason's eyes had meant more than just a passing glance. She wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was reaching out to her too, in his own way. And yet, there was a creeping feeling of guilt. Should she have let it go? Should she have pushed away the thought of being seen, really seen, for the first time in so long? This internal conflict was tearing at her. On one hand, the motherly instinct to care for Jason, his isolation, his loneliness, pulled her closer. But on the other hand, something darker was beginning to creep in. The realization that maybe she was not just seeking to comfort him, but seeking something for herself, something that she had lost somewhere along the way. The connection she was beginning to feel with Jason was undeniable, but it was also dangerous. It blurred the lines between what was acceptable and what wasn't. What had started as a motherly concern was quickly becoming something more, a complex, tangled web of emotions and desires that neither of them fully understood. Claire didn't know where this would lead. She didn't know if it was a moment of weakness or if it was something that could grow into something more. All she knew was that, in that instant, the loneliness that had defined her life for so long seemed to fade, replaced by a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't invisible after all. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't sure whether to embrace it or run away. But the question loomed large in her heart. Could she ever go back to the way things were? Could she ever unsee what she had seen in Jason's eyes? Or had everything changed forever? As the days drifted into weeks, Claire began to notice subtle changes in her relationship with Jason. At first, they were barely noticeable, small shifts that might have been dismissed as mere coincidences, but gradually, the silence between them began to feel less distant and more intimate. Jason, the teenager who had once closed himself off behind a wall of headphones and hoodies, started to engage with her in a way that left Claire both confused and strangely comforted. It wasn't just the moments when he would casually help her with groceries or offer a quiet nod when she shared a TV show recommendation. It was in the deeper, unspoken moments, the way he now lingered in the kitchen while she prepared dinner, asking her about her day, the soft smiles he gave her when their eyes met. Those brief exchanges, though small, were like threads slowly weaving a bond between them, one Claire hadn't realized she desperately craved. Jason wasn't the only one changing. With every passing day, Claire found herself drawn to him in ways she didn't fully understand. There was something in the way he looked at her now, a quiet intensity that seemed to go beyond casual conversation. She noticed how his gaze lingered a moment longer than it should, how his questions about her life held a weight that suggested something more than mere curiosity. And every time he reached out, even in the smallest way, Claire felt a warmth that had been absent for so long in her marriage. But as this new connection grew, so did the tension inside Claire. The tenderness she felt for Jason was undeniably comforting, but with it came a deep, unsettling sense of guilt. She had never planned for any of this. She had never intended for a bond with her stepson to cross the line between motherly concern and something more. But the more time they spent together, the more their interactions felt charged with an emotional undercurrent that neither of them fully understood. It wasn't just about Jason anymore. It was about Claire too. She realized, in moments of quiet reflection, that she was seeking something she had lost. The connection she once had with Ethan had withered into nothingness, and in Jason's small gestures, in his quiet attention, Claire found herself yearning for the intimacy she had been missing for so long. It wasn't something she had actively sought. It wasn't about love or desire in the conventional sense, but it was a craving for attention, for being seen, for having someone notice her as more than just the woman who did the laundry and cooked the meals. The feelings she had toward Jason were complicated. She wasn't sure if they were born from her own emotional loneliness, or if, somehow, Jason had reached a place within her that no one else had. What once felt like a motherly instinct to care for him now seemed to bleed into something else, something unspoken and dangerous. Each time she looked into his eyes, each time their conversations lingered just a little too long, Claire felt herself being pulled deeper into a web she wasn't sure she wanted to be in, but also couldn't escape. And so, with every moment that passed, Claire found herself at a crossroads, caught between the undeniable warmth of this connection with Jason and the growing awareness that it was something that could not be easily undone. The lines between what was appropriate and what wasn't began to blur, and Claire was left to wonder, had she crossed a line she could never return from? As the days wore on, the emotional distance between Claire and Jason began to feel less like an obstacle and more like a subtle, undeniable pull. At first, Claire attributed his changes to simple teenage growth. She told herself that his quiet demeanor, the way he increasingly retreated to his room, and the long silences between them were just phases, teenage awkwardness, nothing more. But deep down, Claire knew it wasn't just that. Something had shifted, something that was slowly drawing them closer, even as it pulled them further from the lines of what was appropriate. Jason had always been a mystery to Claire. A boy scarred by his past, his mother's sudden departure when he was just a child, leaving a void he hadn't known how to fill. Ethan, his father, had closed off that chapter of Jason's life, leaving it unspoken and unresolved. But Claire couldn't help but wonder if the silence surrounding Jason's life was a result of that loss, a loss that had shaped him into the quiet, reserved young man he was. She had tried in small ways to reach him, to offer him comfort and understanding, but he had always seemed too far away, too absorbed in his own world. But now, Jason's presence seemed to fill every room in ways that both comforted and disturbed Claire. He was still reserved, but there were moments, fleeting, fragile moments, when he would look at her in a way that made her heart skip a beat. He began to seek her out, sometimes sitting near her while she cooked, sometimes asking about her day, sometimes simply staying in the same space, as if the act of being close to her meant something more. The warmth between them, however, wasn't without its complexities. It wasn't the kind of closeness that could be easily explained. Claire knew with every fiber of her being that this connection was not simply about motherly care. It wasn't about the small, everyday gestures of kindness or concern. It was something deeper, something that had been sparked by Jason's vulnerability, by his quiet admissions of pain, of insecurity. For the first time, he was allowing someone in, and that someone was Claire. But as much as she tried to deny it, there was a tension that Claire couldn't ignore. Each conversation, each moment shared with Jason seemed to weigh heavily on her, pulling her deeper into a space where right and wrong no longer seemed as clear. She wasn't sure when the line had started to blur, or when the innocent care she had for him began to feel like something more. What had once been a simple act of compassion, of trying to make him feel seen, was now tangled with something she couldn't quite name. She wasn't sure if she was helping him, or if, perhaps, she was helping herself in the process. She had spent so many years feeling invisible to Ethan, her husband, who had become a ghost in their home. But Jason, despite his guardedness, had seen her in ways that no one else had. In his quiet company, Claire felt a warmth she hadn't realized she was missing, a sense of connection that, at times, made her forget the loneliness that had defined so much of her marriage. But at what cost? As their bond deepened, the guilt began to settle in. Was she betraying her own role as a stepmother? Was she blurring the lines between caring and longing for something more? In these moments of quiet, Claire was confronted with the realization that she was caught in an emotional tug-of-war. Her desire to protect Jason, to give him the love and attention he needed, was increasingly mingled with her own need to be seen, to be understood, to feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. The boundaries she had once held so firmly were now slipping through her fingers, leaving her grappling with a powerful and deeply confusing emotional connection. And as much as she wanted to deny it, she knew there was no turning back. The lines had already been crossed, whether she acknowledged it or not. As the days stretched on, Claire found herself standing on the precipice of a complicated and emotionally charged situation. The connection she had unknowingly fostered with Jason had deepened in ways she hadn't expected, and now it was impossible to ignore. Each day brought new moments of intimacy, but not in the traditional sense. It wasn't the kind of closeness she had with a partner. It was something more vulnerable, more raw, and more uncomfortable. It was as though every time Jason reached out, whether with a small smile, a hesitant touch, or an unexpected conversation, Claire's heart ached with the realization that something was shifting. And yet, the more it shifted, the more she felt her own sense of self unravel. She had promised herself, sworn even, that she would never cross a line with Jason. He was her stepson, and as such, she was supposed to be the protector, the motherly figure who guided him through life's challenges, not the woman who became emotionally entangled in his private world. But as time went on, that promise started to feel increasingly impossible to keep. There were moments when Jason's vulnerability, his need for understanding, seemed to mirror her own. She couldn't help but be drawn to him, as if his emotional openness was pulling her into a space where their roles as stepmother and stepson no longer seemed to matter. What Claire hadn't expected was how much she, too, would begin to lean on Jason. His quiet presence became a lifeline in the midst of her own loneliness. For so long, Ethan, her husband, had been emotionally absent, his distance growing as the days passed. Claire had tried to fill the emptiness with work, with daily routines, with anything that would distract her from the cold silence in their home. But Jason, despite his own emotional struggles, had unknowingly filled that space with something she hadn't realized she needed: attention, connection, and validation. She felt guilty for these emotions. She felt guilty for not being able to stop the feelings that were growing inside her. But more than that, she felt confused. Was she truly helping Jason, or was she simply using him as a balm for her own emotional wounds? Was her concern for him purely out of maternal instinct, or was it a reflection of something deeper, something darker, that she didn't want to confront? As their bond grew, so did the guilt that weighed heavily on Claire's chest. She knew that whatever this connection was, it had crossed boundaries that she could no longer ignore. Jason's vulnerability had opened a door that she had never intended to open, and now she wasn't sure how to close it. She couldn't simply undo the moments of shared intimacy, the quiet exchanges that had made her feel seen and understood in ways she hadn't been in years. The emotional tug-of-war inside her was relentless. On one hand, Claire wanted to protect Jason from the emotional turmoil he was facing. She wanted to be there for him in ways that no one else seemed to be. On the other hand, she knew that her emotional involvement was dangerous not just for her own sense of self, but for the integrity of her marriage, her relationship with Jason, and their family as a whole. And so, Claire stood at a crossroads. She had no answers, no clear path forward. She couldn't undo what had already happened, nor could she ignore the emotional connection that had developed. What she did know was that the silence in their home had become even louder, and the lines that had once been so clear between right and wrong were now blurred beyond recognition. The only thing that was certain was that nothing would ever be the same again. And as the days stretched on, Claire was left wondering if she could ever find a way to navigate this complicated, shifting space without losing herself in the process. As the connection between Claire and Jason deepened, so did the undeniable weight of the emotions they both carried. Emotions that neither of them fully understood, yet were impossible to ignore. It had started so innocently, with small acts of kindness, shared moments of vulnerability, and fleeting glances that hinted at something unspoken. But now, those small moments had evolved into something more, something that Claire wasn't sure she could manage anymore. Jason's presence in her life had started to fill a void she hadn't even realized was there. He had been a quiet figure in her world for so long, but with his subtle shifts toward her, his small unspoken gestures of trust, she found herself drawn in. He wasn't the child she once tried to care for, nor was he the distant teenager he had been just months ago. He was something new, something that challenged Claire's understanding of herself and her role in his life. But as they spent more time together, as Jason began to rely on her more, Claire could feel the uncomfortable stirrings of guilt. She had always prided herself on being a good wife, a good mother. At least, she had tried to be. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that, in her growing emotional involvement with Jason, she was crossing boundaries that were never meant to be crossed. Was she truly helping him, or was she using him as an emotional crutch? Was this motherly concern or something more complex, something darker? She had always been taught that emotional attachment to a stepson was harmless. After all, what could be wrong with offering comfort to someone in need? But now, the lines between what was right and wrong felt impossibly blurred. Jason's struggles with his own sense of identity, his own body image, had slowly become the focus of their interactions. He reached out to Claire with questions, with insecurities, with fears that he had never voiced before. In those moments, he wasn't the angry teenager hiding behind walls. He was just a young man, lost, trying to make sense of his place in the world. And Claire, in turn, wanted to help him. She wanted to reassure him, to remind him that he was okay, that he wasn't broken. But in doing so, she also began to question her own emotional needs. What was it about Jason's vulnerability that drew her in so strongly? What was it about him that made her feel seen, even when no one else seemed to notice her? The answer, Claire realized with a painful clarity, was that she had been starving for attention, for affection, for someone to truly see her beyond the surface. Her marriage to Ethan had become a quiet, invisible thing where he barely acknowledged her, where the warmth between them had long since evaporated. Jason, though, with his quiet presence and genuine need for reassurance, had filled that void. And though it was wrong to admit, Claire knew that she had grown to crave the closeness, the shared moments of connection. But with that realization came the undeniable guilt. She knew that this bond with Jason, however innocent it seemed, was not something she could easily explain or justify. It was dangerous, not just for her own sense of self, but for their family, for the fragile fabric of relationships that had always seemed so solid. She wondered, with a deep sense of dread, what would happen if Ethan ever found out, what kind of damage it could do to the trust that was already so fragile. Would she lose everything she had built, or had it already been lost in the silence that had pervaded her marriage for so long? The hardest part for Claire was knowing that there were no easy answers. The connection between her and Jason had already been forged, and the consequences of it were too complex to fully understand. As much as she tried to distance herself, as much as she tried to force herself to stop caring, she couldn't. She was entangled in something much deeper than she had intended. And now, the question wasn't just about what she had done. It was about what she was willing to do to preserve the fragile, broken pieces of her life. The weight of guilt that Claire carried was unbearable, settling deep into her chest with each passing day. The connection with Jason had transformed from something seemingly innocent into a complex emotional landscape that Claire could no longer navigate without hesitation. She had always believed in clear boundaries. Her role as a wife, as a stepmother, was defined and unmistakable. But as time went on, those boundaries had blurred, and now she found herself questioning everything she once held to be true. Every moment she shared with Jason, no matter how small or fleeting, seemed to only deepen the sense of emotional entanglement. His vulnerability had been like a thread, pulling her into a space she wasn't sure she wanted to be in, but couldn't escape. And as much as she tried to push back, to remind herself of the lines she had promised never to cross, she felt herself slipping further and further into a place she hadn't intended to go. Each time Jason reached out to her, whether with a quiet question about his struggles or an unspoken look that seemed to say so much more, she felt the pull in her chest grow stronger. The guilt was pervasive, weaving itself into every moment of her life. She had always prided herself on being the strong, caring figure in Jason's life, someone who could offer him the comfort he needed without crossing any lines. But now, that role felt increasingly complicated. What had started as a desire to help, to ease his pain, had become something else entirely. She wasn't just comforting him anymore. She was searching for something within herself, something she had been missing for so long. The emotional connection that had formed between them felt like a lifeline, but it was one that was slowly choking her, making her question her own motives. She wondered if she was using Jason, if she had crossed a line in her own need for connection. Was this just maternal instinct, or was it something more? She couldn't help but feel that, in helping him, she was also feeding a need within herself, one that had been neglected for years. Her marriage to Ethan had become an empty shell, devoid of the warmth and intimacy it once held. She had tried for so long to fill that void with other distractions, but nothing had worked. Jason, in his own struggle, had become the person who unknowingly offered her a kind of emotional refuge. But the longer it went on, the more she realized that her desire for his attention was about more than just helping him. It was about her own hunger for emotional closeness. The worst part was that she couldn't shake the feeling that this connection was somehow her fault. The choices she had made, the moments she allowed to linger, the ways she had leaned on Jason, all of it felt like a betrayal. A betrayal not just to Ethan, her husband, but to herself and the values she had always held dear. She had been the one to let the boundaries slip, and now it felt like there was no going back. Jason, in his quiet way, seemed to be pulling away from her, distancing himself, and the silence between them became even more suffocating. She watched as he retreated further into himself, as if he, too, understood that the connection between them was becoming something that could not be easily undone. The guilt that Claire felt became heavier with each passing day, threatening to consume her. She wanted to reach out to him, to fix everything, to undo the emotional mess she had created, but she didn't know how. The damage, it seemed, had already been done. The only question now was whether they could both find a way to navigate this complicated, painful landscape without losing themselves entirely. As the days passed, Claire felt the weight of the silence grow heavier, and with it, a growing sense of disquiet that threatened to unravel everything she had once known. The connection between her and Jason, once small and seemingly innocent, had transformed into something far more complicated and fraught with emotional tension. She could feel the shift in the air, like a storm brewing just on the horizon, and she wasn't sure whether it would destroy everything in its path or pass quietly, leaving her to pick up the pieces of a broken reality. The guilt she felt was overwhelming, suffocating her at every turn. She had tried to tell herself that she was only trying to help, that her actions had been driven by the best of intentions, that she had only been a mother trying to care for her stepson. But as time went on, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that she had crossed a line that had once been so clear but now seemed like a distant memory. Each moment of closeness with Jason, each conversation that lingered just a little too long, each unspoken glance, only deepened the complexity of their relationship. What had once been simple maternal concern now felt dangerously close to something else, something she didn't want to name, something she wasn't sure she could control. Jason, for his part, had begun to pull away. The emotional distance between them had started to grow, and Claire could sense that he, too, was wrestling with the unspoken shift in their relationship. He had always been a quiet and reserved young man, but now there was a hardness in his eyes, a withdrawal that felt like a shield. It was as if he had realized, just as she had, that something had changed between them. And just like her, he didn't know how to fix it. The weight of their unspoken tension hung heavily in the air, and Claire couldn't help but wonder if they had already gone too far to ever return to the way things were. She spent her nights alone, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with questions and doubts. Was she the villain in her own story? Was she simply a lonely woman searching for validation in all the wrong places? Or was this an unavoidable consequence of two people, both broken in their own ways, finding solace in one another's presence? She didn't know anymore. All she knew was that she couldn't erase what had happened, couldn't undo the connection that had formed between them, no matter how hard she tried. The emotional bond was now a part of her, embedded in her heart, constant reminder of her own weaknesses and desires. At the same time, Claire couldn't escape the growing sense of hopelessness that lingered in the space between her and Ethan. He remained distant, as though he were a stranger, a shadow in their home. Their marriage had become a mere formality, devoid of warmth, of intimacy. She had tried to fill the emptiness with moments of connection with Jason, but even as that bond deepened, she knew it wasn't a solution. It was a temporary escape from the painful reality of a marriage that had withered into something unrecognizable. The silence that hung in their home felt deafening. The walls that once seemed to offer comfort now felt like they were closing in on her, trapping her in a web of guilt, confusion, and longing. And no matter how much she tried to distance herself from Jason, she knew deep down that she couldn't unfeel what she had felt. The damage, she realized, had already been done, and the only question now was whether she could find a way to live with the consequences or whether they would continue to haunt her forever. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Everything had changed, and there was no turning back.